Welcome to this CMHRC learning event where we will be talking about parenting with confidence and calm. For those of you who are new to CMHRC, my name is Elizabeth Errico and I'm the Executive Director. Our mission here at CMHRC is to provide guidance and resources for early identification and management of mood disorders like bipolar disorder and its newly identified phenotype known as fear of harm, which is thermoregulatory sleep dysregulation disorder. Our learning objectives today include differentiating between developmentally expected dysregulation versus chronic dysregulation due to an illness or condition, explain how traditional parenting models don't work with those who live in a chronic state of dysregulation, to identify how palliative parenting helps bridge the gaps between dysregulation and regulation in times of escalated symptoms, and to examine the three pillars of palliative parenting. With me today are two very special guests. The first is Jennifer Sevick. She is our clinical director here at CMHRC, and she is a licensed independent social worker. Along with her is Joshua Castillo, who is a mentor on our ketogenic therapy study and also a palliative parenting class instructor. So, Jen, Joshua, welcome. Please feel free to turn on your camera at this point. We will start our wonderful conversation about this. And I'm going to invite anybody who is in the audience to go ahead and put your questions into the Q&A. We will be monitoring this as we go through our presentation today, and any questions that you ask, I will be integrating into our discussion. So Jen, Joshua, welcome.
Thank you.
So we're going to just sort of dive right in here with our first learning objective, and I want to ask, what is developmentally expected dysregulation?
Yes, so I'll take this one. I'll start off with it. So what we're looking at over the course of a child's life is that they're going to have a variety of emotions, a variety of ideas. So one thing is when they do not agree, there should be pushback, right? When they're shocked, surprised, don't agree, there should be pushback. So over the course of their evolution, it starts off with grunting, groaning, crying excessively. And then over time, it becomes nuanced, right? So as they get older, it's not that they become more malleable or like robots that they say yes all the time, but the pushback becomes far more sophisticated. So from crying to maybe tantruming, but then, oh, I shouldn't lay on the floor. That's not effective. I'll stand up while I tantrum, to, oh, maybe I should throw in some negotiation, or maybe I should now read the room as well. Or maybe now I'm asking for future yeses because this no is a firm no in the moment. And so over time, your kid is still going to be on occasion resistant, but their approach to getting their way should evolve as they get older. So what we're saying with children who have mood disorders or have something else going on that you may not know is that their development in this pushback progression gets stunted. And so it stays very raw, very basic. They don't read the room. They don't move toward negotiation. They don't have sassy expressions as maybe a preteen should have. And so that's what signals to us something, this is more complicated. This is a problem that needs more deep dive and digging rather than, oh, they just keep flipping out, right? Because most children don't just flip out over and over in the same style. The style should progress and become more nuanced.
So you're really saying that we need to expect pushback from our children, that is an expected part of growing up, but that what that pushback looks like evolves and changes as they grow and mature physically and cognitively.
Precisely. And then you can see it has matured over time. But if you're still dealing with the same exact big, loud, kind of immature response to not wanting something or being surprised, that's a signal that something else may be going on.
So when we see that, we're looking at something that is not a developmentally expected dysregulation.
Absolutely.
Jen, um, what's your take on this?
Yeah, so when we're looking at is there a possible mood disorder or is there a neurological condition? Is there some sort of medical issue that's going on? We're looking at these not as intentional choices. These are traditionally called behavioral disorders, and it truly frustrates me because these are not behavioral disorders in the sense that behavior is a choice. And these are not choices. This is not intentional. This is not due to manipulation, trying to get one's way, or attention seeking at all. These are involuntary symptoms that are occurring. I like to say that these are observable physiological symptoms that very much are rooted in a biological cause. So we can actually see the symptoms in action when they're screaming, when they're yelling, when they're running away, when they're shutting down. All of this is information and it's telling us that there's something that is going on. And these are deeply rooted in the limbic system. So we think about that fight, flight, or freeze, the amygdala, the hippocampus, the hypothalamus. All of those are impacted. And so there is a reason why we are witnessing what we're witnessing. And there is an actual reason why this is happening and that child is experiencing these.
So it's so interesting that you are making this distinction between behavior and symptoms, because I think most adults who either parent or give care to children or teach or are involved in working with children expect that when a child engages in a particular behavior, they're doing it intentionally, that the actions that we as the observer can witness must be on purpose. So, what you're really saying is that they're not.
Yeah, absolutely. It's not. And that's why traditional models don't actually work.
So, how do we? So, if we're looking at this idea of what's developmentally expected in terms of pushback and what's not, how do we determine what is intentional and what's not?
So when you look at a
So,
child, oh, go ahead, Jennifer.
oh no, no, no. You
I
go
cut
ahead.
you off. I think when you look at a child, you have to remove yourself from your analytical lens. And what you're actually starting to look for is repetition or a pattern that you can identify. And so when you see a child consistently flaring up or getting stuck or becoming overwhelmed with intense emotion, you start to say, wow, this lasted how many minutes? Huh, he's had other issues with food. This is when I ask the child to do something. So you start to remove yourself from when it happens and start to say, are there common denominators? Are there common denominators? That starts to lead you toward what may be the thing you're investigating more deeply. Oh, this is how this kid is reading transitions, or this is how this kid is managing overwhelm or fear or exhaustion. Or it could be, wow, they all come back to me. And I'm tempted to be snappy on those occasions or rushing. And so it's about patterns, response patterns, and that gives you information. I think that Jennifer is trying to alert us toward that there is a deeper issue at hand that needs support.
Right. And we say that a child does well when they can do well. And universally, they want to do well. And so when this is interfering across all areas of environment, so it's interfering with school, it's interfering with friendships, it's interfering with family relationships, it's impacting families financially, then what we're looking at is that there's something else we need to look deeper at what is really going on here.
So we have a question that's come up in the Q&A here, and the person is asking about, what about a child, I'll put that in quotes, who's over 18, who is still displaying a lot of the behaviors that you've mentioned, both of you, in terms of perhaps aggression, or verbal or physical aggression, dysregulation when they're asked to do something. What is the recourse that we have as parents and caregivers if the child is already that old, that big, and we're dealing with these challenging, quote, behaviors, which Jen, you and Joshua are both describing as symptoms?
Mhm. Yeah, so with you're right, it does become more challenging when they're legally able to make their own choices. And so we want to approach this very carefully and respect their autonomy and their decision making. But I look at it from the angle of that this person is hurting. They're symptomatic, they don't understand why. Often they're resistant to any sort of intervention because they've already been there, done that. So they've been to doctors, they've been to therapists, they've had maybe multiple different types of interventions at school. Parents have tried various different parenting approaches. Nothing has seemed to work for them over the years. And so for the parent to be able to partner with that child very realistically, and acknowledging and validating that their experiences were real, that disappointment, that nothing ever seemed to work, but acknowledging that this is worth going and working towards a better future for them, that this is not their fault, right? And just to really be able to concentrate on that. And then working together to find the appropriate resources for them. So I do acknowledge it's so much harder when they're older because of all the years of experience of being disappointed, of a lot of interventions were simply just not helpful up to that point.
So I'm hearing you really talk about empathy, about leading with empathy
Mhm.
and understanding that the person who's dysregulated is the person who is experiencing the primary disruption. And that whatever is happening to a parent or a caregiver or someone else in the environment, that's actually secondary to the excuse me, to the primary disruption. Joshua, did you have anything you wanted to add to that?
Um, I think it is difficult when children get older and older and enter adulthood. It's the feeling of doom that now it's too late. Um, but I would advocate for still holding on to hope in that failed experiences in the past, whether it's in parenting, advice you've gotten from people or from books, if they have failed to be the right fit, if you're here watching this, it means you're still striving to find the right thing, the set of tools that will shift you to where you want to be shifted toward. It isn't actually too late. So when you find a new tool, and hopefully this will give you some relief or a new set of a fresh perspective on it, that fresh perspective allows you to try again and to try differently. And so even though your child is 18, 19, 20, 30, whatever age, it's the opportunity to bring fresh perspective and with clarity to try one thing differently. So not overwhelm yourself and become idealistic only to crash and burn, right? Because our disappointment is maybe much smaller than our ill person's disappointment, right? Because they're constantly working 110% harder than anyone else in the room. So it's the ability to keep seeking resources, fresh perspective. And you know what? Sometimes your kid being older may work to your benefit because they have a lot more, say, failures and successes to connect it to. So it's not always age that is the best thing. Sometimes it's the fresh perspective.
So Jen, you mentioned sort of traditional parenting approaches, which a lot of people would argue like they're traditional approaches because they've worked traditionally. So what exactly is it that you're saying doesn't work about those traditional approaches in this context?
Yeah, so a lot of the evidence-based approaches that are being used by therapists, psychiatrists, teachers in classrooms, they really count on being able to partner with that child and that there's logic and reasoning and we can reach them. What we discovered in our community, though, were parents who said, but what happens when your child's baseline is always dysregulated to some degree? Sometimes it's more severely dysregulated, and sometimes their baseline is chronic anxiety, and it doesn't take much to trigger them into severe dysregulation. And so, because of that, we decided that we needed to bridge that gap. And so we answered that. This is what we do when their baseline is dysregulated. This is how we approach our child. This is how we navigate the path forward as a family. And this is what's going to improve quality of life. It is going to decrease the intensity of that dysregulation, and also hopefully the frequency of those. And so that's really the goal, is to be that bridge so that they can become more accessible to using those traditional models and those traditional coping skills. But while this is raw and we're in that situation, this is what we found as a community that's really effective.
Joshua?
I would add that most books you read, podcasts, IG, all the things are really targeting, say, this. If a kid were a car, it's the kids who are on neutral or shifting to drive easily, right? There's no pumping the gas, there's no balancing with the brake. It's kids who exist without thinking about past or present too much. And so you can throw a curveball and they're like, okay, let's play ball. Put your shoes on this moment instead of in 30 minutes. Okay. And so chances are they're kind of positive people and they don't exert a lot of effort to do things to fulfill requests or their own wishes. Our community are children who are traditionally sleep deprived. So, how much energy would they actually have for these small apps? These are kids who may have dietary challenges. So, how hungry do they feel or how constipated might they be? These are kids who may not know that they're dehydrated. These are kids who may or may not be aware how sensitive to sound they are, or lights, or amount of people in a room. And so we are coaching children who are not in neutral, who are not in drive. They're just kind of spinning the wheels and the tires are turning constantly, but no one is aware that that's happening. So they're trying to get up and go, but they're dragging a lot of weight behind them. And so traditional parenting doesn't take an account into kids who have nightmares all night and can't figure out, was that real or was it a dream? These are kids who are like, people keep yelling at me, but I'm trying my best, but I can't do it. But they have no words to express. You don't know how hard this is, even though it's just writing my name, right? There's no way to express that despair, exhaustion, fear. And so we're saying we do actually see it. And because we see it and acknowledge it, we've created these tools, as opposed to let's pretend it's not happening and they should be able to suck it up. And that's why there's a big abyss between traditional and palliative parenting.
So you're really talking about the idea that of reorienting the perspective from that of what the parent wants to that what the child is capable of in any given moment.
Yes, because at many times, both of you do actually want similar things. You both want a party, but maybe theirs is with animals and yours is not. Similar happiness, like you both want happiness or you want joy, but your kid's ability to access it is really, really, it's like an obstacle course. So we need people to see the obstacle course. They're still trying to get to joy, but there's a lot of potholes along the way for them.
And when I hear you talk about sleep, I immediately start thinking about stamina, right? And how much energy it takes to just get through the day for any regular old person. And that you describe these children in our community who it's like their stamina is being used up too quickly by things that we can't see. Is that right?
Yes, because there are no words, particularly if your child has been struggling from very early on in their life, it's part of their normal. So they don't have a sense that this fatigue that I'm dragging around, I should share. They think maybe everyone is equally fatigued, or I'm being tormented by this nightmare I keep having. They think, well, I guess you're charging on. You've had similar nightmares. And so there's a deficit that your child learns to live with without expressing or identifying. And so it is unfair when we just have practical expectations because they don't have, say, a typical tank of energy. Their battery has many holes in it, but we aren't aware. So we're saying, hurry up. Didn't you hear me? And they're like, I did hear you. I did hear you, but it took so much energy just to get into the room. And now you're asking all these other things.
Interesting. Jen, I think what one of the things that Josh was talking about here has to do also with like not just capacity, but also availability, right? And I've heard you talk in the past about that difficulty that people in general, but in particular in this case, kids who are struggling with mood disorders, like the difficulty to access that availability when they're dysregulated. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. So when children are dysregulated, and we had touched on it briefly a few moments ago when we talked about there are things that are happening in their limbic system, they're working so hard just to keep it together. They're working so hard just to stay in their chair. They're working so hard not to break down in tears or to be able to yell out. They're doing everything they can to just be okay in that moment. And it takes so much energy and so much work. And so when plans change, because they already had this thought, okay, this is the way my teacher said it was going to happen. This is the way my parents said it was going to happen. This is the way that it happens every day. This is the expected. But most typically developing children, as Joshua described, who are in neutral, they can pivot. They might be disappointed, but they can pivot. And children who have a mood disorder or who have a developmental disorder, or other medical conditions that are happening, they can't because the energy just isn't there. All of that is spent just trying to be centered in that moment. And when they have a different plan, it means that it's going to have to go through all the processes in their head. It's going to take so much work and effort to get a new vision for them. And it just seems so overwhelming and so impossible. And then we see that dysregulation in action, whether it's they shut down, whether they're screaming profanity, or they're tipping over a desk or a chair, and it is disproportional to the situation. It would seem like, having to return back to math after a fire drill should not lead to all of this stuff that is happening. But for the child, that was a major disruption that they didn't plan for, and they have no way to plan around that because everything else has to be rearranged mentally in their brain. It just takes so much effort. And so they're not available in that moment to use those coping skills. We hear oftentimes from families, But the therapist went over this with them. I sat in that office and they could tell me exactly what they were going to do. We planned for this, right? And it doesn't matter how much planning ahead of time that we're going to have, because in a situation where you're not actually in a medical episodic crisis, because this is what's actually happening. This is physiological. It is a medical urgency, but we don't see that. We label it as uncooperative, trying to have their way and being manipulative. All the negative labels we could just really slap on there. But in reality, what is happening is their entire body, their entire system has been thrown off. And so this is why they're not accessible to be able to access those quote coping skills, because in the moment, it's not about coping, it's about survival. And then when it becomes about survival, what do we say? It's that fight, it's that flight, it's that freeze. And so that is what is happening. And we really need to try to de-escalate that. And there is a path forward, hopefully in, when we know these things, prevention. So preventative is the best path forward. Those accommodations, those modifications at home, at school, and other environments. We can't predict everything. There are things that are just going to happen. And so when they do, we have to be aware of not assuming that this is a child who just wants their way, that they're being a brat. What we have to do is the assumption goes the other way. Even if we don't know the cause, even if we don't know what triggered it, um, the first response really needs to be, oh, we're already in it. We're already in crisis meltdown mode. Now what we need to do is, from a palliative lens, from how can we soothe this? How can we make this better for them? How can we make it better for everybody else in the room, everybody else in the family? What do we need to do? Um, how do we do that so that this doesn't escalate into something else or trigger a bigger episode? And Dr. Robert Post talks about this a lot.
So I'm going to add in a question here that I'm seeing coming in from the Q&A, which we get all of the time, which is basically asking, when a child was able to do the thing yesterday, why are we being instructed to assume that they can't do it today? And what's the disconnect between those two? And I'm sort of reminded of something I know you say a lot, Jen, which is that the only consistency is inconsistency. So can you speak to that issue?
Yeah. So when we're talking about mental illness, when we're talking about medical conditions and developmental disorders, what happens is that these are often episodic and cyclical. And Joshua talked about, we don't know what type of sensitivities that they have to sound, to and this sounds radically wild to parents: temperature, barometric pressure, um, whether or not it is raining today and cloudy, or whether or not it's sunshiny and bright. Those things really make a difference on a biological level. We don't necessarily recognize that, right? And so that's why it's inconsistent. And especially when we're talking about mood disorders, there's this diurnal, like this everyday kind of aspect to it that can change. And so many things can be there that we don't understand. And so that's why, oh, they had a good morning. We should be able to return to it because they did it in the morning. Well, they may have been going to recess, where it's hot and sweaty outside and they're running around in the cafeteria where there were a lot of bodies. And of course, it's warm. And they may have also had gym class as well and PE. And so that temperature change is something that most people, I would say on average, can handle. these kids are super sensitive to it. And so it seems like nothing changed, but everything changed. And so we don't always recognize what it is right away, which is why it's so important to not make assumptions that this is purposeful, because lots of things fluctuate all throughout the day.
Mm. Joshua, do you have anything that you wanted to add to that before we move on to our next question?
I can say it goes back to looking at patterns. If your child fails to repeat strategy, successful strategy, it's not that your kid is lazy or stubborn or willful. It's that there's a lack. There's something that's missing that's blocking them from consistently using successful strategy,
Mhm.
right? And so you have to see, like I said, the bigger picture. Well, on Sunday, she could put on the shoes and get out the door, but the rest of the days she wasn't. So then what was different about Sunday than the rest of the days, right? So you have to do detective work almost in reverse, because for most typical developing children, once you do a successful strategy, whether it's the way you put your backpack on, you sling it on your shoulder to the right, and then you put in your left arm, humans typically, once they figure out how to do something, they repeat that system if they haven't been met up with a lot of resistance on the other end. So, why is it that your child can't repeat a successful
Mm.
strategy that they figured out? Why do you have to keep breaking it down? That again signals that there's a skill set that's missing, or they can't access the skill set due to what? Stress, exhaustion, hunger, physical, some kind of physical disruption, neurodiversity. So there's a whole host of reasons that are blocking their access to a certain skill set. So that's what we're trying to identify instead of blaming the child.
You know, I'm as I was listening to you say all of that, I was thinking about your car analogy. And it seems to me that, and maybe I'm going to ruin your car analogy, so I apologize in advance. But it occurred to me that it's almost as though if you go to turn your car on Sunday and it turns on, and you try to turn it on Monday and it doesn't, and then you try to turn it on Tuesday and it does, the very first thing you would be thinking is there's an inconsistency here. There must be a problem that needs to be fixed. And the difference here really is that a lot of traditional parenting models would say the thing that needs to be fixed is the child's obedience. Whereas what you are saying is that what needs to be fixed is the obstacle the child is facing needs to be resolved.
Yeah. So, like traditionally, it's say it louder, firmer, repeatedly, right? So it's if we're using the car, we'll keep turning the key or push the button because that's where we are nowadays, right? So you keep doing this one thing instead of, well, then, but wait, are you checking that there's gas? Are you checking there isn't a rock in front of your one of your tires? Are you checking that your alternator? Like over time, you should start checking other things, right? You wouldn't just stare at the key and the ignition. And so that's what happens in parenting. We get stuck on the delivery of the expectation. And we say it louder, stronger, meaner, kinder, with guilt. But we keep doing the same strategy over and over. And that's why palliative addresses a variety of approaches where traditional has one way, but you just increase the frequency or intensity of the ask.
So that's a great segue into my next question, which is, you know, if we're talking about this different paradigm, sort of bridging gaps, um, does this new way of looking at the parenting replace everything that's come before it? Um, does it include some of those traditional parenting strategies? How does that work?
So what I like to say to parents when they come to me is I say, we didn't reinvent the wheel, right? That would have been that just would have been too much work. It would have been mind blowing. What I say is that what we did in our community was we took the wheel apart and we go, okay, well, what's working? And then we put it back together in a way that made sense for us. So we are using strategies that are evidence-based, but what we did was we collectively came together and we said, well, what is working? Like, because some of us have been doing this for quite a while and we figured this out, and then we're coming together and talking about this as parents and as peers, and now this is working and we're sharing with other people. This is great, it's working for our community, but now how can we help the broader community that isn't necessarily aware of this? And so we are using strategies, part of other evidence-based models, but we put it together in a way that makes sense if your child has chronic dysregulation or is experiencing intermittent medical issues, in a way that makes sense and in a way that protects that child's confidence, and respects them and accepts them for who they are. But it also, most importantly, protects that relationship between the parent and the child. And that's the part that I am very proud of, because all the way it is a paradigm shift. It is how the parent is responding, how the parent is planning, how the parent is partnering, and how that parent is advocating. And the part that is beautiful is it's about that relationship.
Joshua?
Yes, I agree with all that, Jennifer. I think the what is different for me feels like there is a time and a place for a lot of parenting philosophies, and but what palliative says is, how can you reset as a family? So not just your little dysregulated human or medium or big human. Um, how do you all come down to center to have a fresh perspective of how are we together going to take on life? And so you begin to take on life with new strategies, fresh perspective, in the hopes that over time, your kid is now carrying their own weight, right? So, uh, and for many of the kids in our community, carry your own weight literally might mean figure out how to carry their own bag to the car and what they need to be in that bag to go to the park, right? So it is, how do we receive a problem together, an obstacle that my child perceives going to the park is a problem, is a threat? How do we navigate that perspective as a family? How do I help my kid get their bearings with this misread? And then how do they create successful strategy moving forward? And so palliative takes into account, what if everyone needs to reset? What if everyone needs fresh learning tools? And then we proceed forward. So we do not drag children along, scold them along, berate them along. We are really hoping to help them read the environment or obstacles that come their way with a better, more healthy in quotes, but in a way that they see it as I can do, rather I'm being defeated, I'm being attacked. Like, this is uncomfortable. So how will I go about this? Instead of this is uncomfortable, I must defend myself. Right. So it's because we see it from that lens, then we are now coaching from that lens.
So I'm going to throw something at both of you that we hear a lot, which is this idea that, Jen, you're talking about the parent changing the way that they approach the situation. Joshua, you're talking about the parent changing maybe what they're asking their child to do. And one of the things that we hear all the time is people saying, well, how is this realistic for our children? That aren't we just coddling them if we are giving in to their needs and demands all the time? How does that prepare them to live in the real world. And so you've each sort of talked about it from a different perspective. And I'm hoping you can address this issue of why is this not coddling and enabling? How does this actually turn out to be a scaffolding approach? Jen, why don't you go first?
Yeah, so I briefly mentioned the name of Dr. Robert Post, and he is a very well-respected, well-known psychiatrist and researcher. And he has a theory that is accepted, and it's called the kindling effect. And basically, when you have someone who is neurodivergent in some way, whatever that diagnosis or medical condition is, or disorder, that the longer that this is prolonged, the more intense and the more frequent it's going to occur. So if we think about a fire, it may take a lot to get it going at first, but once it gets going, doesn't take much to keep it going. And so the idea is it's not about enabling, it's about that de-escalation, about making sure that this doesn't intensify. We want to really minimize the time between those episodes and minimize that frequency. So what looks like enabling is really medically necessary in order for that child to then be accessible later on and to use all those traditional things if that's appropriate for that child, because sometimes that's not. We still have to make modifications and accommodations for them. But they are more accessible and they're able to be more flexible to interact with their environment. But it takes the environment, the other adults and the other people to be accommodating and flexible for them and really paving that way. So that term enabling really throws me for a loop because it's making sure that we have what is necessary for them to be able to function and to participate and to be a part of. And so that when they are older, and that's the thing I hear what happens when they're adult. Well, because we've been doing this and we've been modeling this, they're going to be able to mirror it and then they're going to be able to do it themselves because it's been happening all along.
Joshua?
So whenever people say enabling, I assume the definition is you're getting your kid from point A to point B without stress, without turmoil, with least amount of effort, right? And so enabling for me is in no way connected to palliative parenting. Um, it is the exact opposite. It's silent, heavy labor in order to create the scaffolding system. And so what Jennifer is referring to is if your kid is under duress, anxious, just not well, that means I have to create a sense of safety or a sense of calm. So they start to read situations as it's uncomfortable, but it's not a trap. It's a shock, but it's not deadly. It's, she's asking me to go there. It might be for a couple minutes. It's not for a lifetime, right? So their brain can't process reality unless their whole system is center, calm, baseline. And so what we're doing is we spend an extraordinary amount of time teaching them through how we connect with them, how to monitor where they are, how to identify how far from baseline am I, so they can articulate what they need in order to get that expectation met, or just to be able to respond in a socially acceptable way. And so enabling means I'm not stopping to teach you. I'm not bothered by that. That's not even on my radar. And that's furthest from what this philosophy is. It's based on, I need my little human to have this skill set. In spite of the challenges they're managing, I'm investing heavily my time, my energy, my tone, shifts in my environment. So how can I help this little person know the waves will come, but they won't drown you? When do you duck under? When do you paddle? When do you get on a boat, right? That's what it is. And so just because we take time to bring down the rage or the big emotion doesn't mean that was the goal. That's the beginning of our process.
So it sounds like what the two of you are saying is that the change really starts with the parent and in their understanding of what their goal as a parent is, and that their goal as a parent is more about modeling these skills and giving their child the kind of supports that will get them to be able to do it independently themselves, not expecting that their child is going to know how to do it just because they're told to do it. Is that what you're saying?
Yes, because you can't learn something unless you practice and fail at it a bunch of times. You're not going to practice and fail unless you feel safe. You're not going to practice and fail or even attempt a new strategy unless you trust the resource giving you that information. So we're asking parents, stop and first become a reliable resource to your child consistently without judgment or shame, or also massive emotions that come inconsistently. So it's all connected to the reliable resource that is you. Then we can slow build skills over time. But you can't just have a kid who's working hard suddenly have this aha moment of like, should respond more maturely. Like that's just not going to happen. It's just not going to happen. But it's what traditional approaches keep trying to convince you it's going to happen. They're just going to have this aha mature awakening. We're saying, nah, there's heavy lifting. There's a messy in between step that no one has written about, no one podcasts about, or makes posts about. There's this other element that speaks particularly to our community. And we're saying, oh, we noticed we made this thing start here. This should actually be the start. Then you can move on to these other things.
Jen, do you have anything you want to add to that before we move on to the next question? There's
Yeah,
a question in the chat specifically asking for a specific example of this.
I have one. So I know a person who is 19 and a half now. Their parent has been using palliative parenting for at least 6 years, or roughly 5 to 6 years now, in terms of understanding that palliative concept. And so they are able to communicate effectively to their parent and to be able to say, I understand that this is what you're feeling, but I need you to look at me right now into my eyes and stop what you're doing. And what they're doing is modeling, mirroring right back what the parent put into them and poured into that. They're able to say, I cannot go to school today. I need to be able to stay home. I need to take care of my body because I feel inside me that there is a mood episode and I need to call the doctor and I need to do the things that need to be done and make the adjustments. That didn't happen by accident. That was the parent believed all along that these were symptoms, not behaviors. The parent helped validate that for a long time. The parent worked with the medical providers, and the medical providers worked with the parent and with the child so that the child had trust in what was happening, so that the child feels, well, now a young adult, feels safe enough to be able to communicate those things effectively, is okay with doing things and making the pivot. And in fact, the parent had shared with me rather recently that the now I say child, but the now 19-year-old said, "Aren't you proud of me? I haven't had a tantrum in like probably a year." Right? And so it was like that slow going out of those things. And to be fair, I want to go back and say that those weren't tantrums, that those were medical emergencies that were happening, but that child was able to, or young adult, learn over the years to self-regulate. And most importantly, that parent was able to learn how to self-regulate, because there's no such thing as a perfect parent. And palliative parenting is that paradigm shift for the parent of how do we stay regulated? And Elizabeth, you say this all the time, and so I steal this from you that when they're spiraling up, we have to spiral down. And how do you do that when everything is just chaos and falling apart? And it's not pretty when things are being thrown at you and words are being hurled that are very hurtful, and that there's some aggression that is going on. It can be utterly soul, like just gut wrenching. But palliative parenting helps us to be brave. It helps us to be able to make these different choices because we know they're right. And on that other side, that isn't the only 19-year-old. We have 18-year-olds, we have 17-year-olds, we have 16-year-olds, we have people who are in their mid 20s. So this is not something that is just for young children. There's never a point where we say, "Oh, it's too late." Because relationships, there's never such a thing as it's too late when it comes to relationships.
So, listening to you talk reminded me of two specific instances from our community that I'm going to share to answer this question. And that is the first is there's a parent in our community who's been using this approach for quite some time, many years. And when they go into the IEP meetings, the school officials very often say, well, how can we be sure that this child is going to say isn't just going to say they don't want to go to school today because they didn't do the homework or they didn't prepare for the test or they didn't, and how is it not just an avoidance strategy? And the thing that the parent always says is because my child has no reason to lie to me, because when they tell me that they're not feeling well, I believe them. And so if my child didn't want to come to school because they didn't prepare for a test, my child would say to me, I don't want to go to school today because they didn't prepare for the test. Because that truth, that honesty between the parent and the child becomes paramount. There is no repercussion for saying, I don't want to go to school today because they didn't prepare for the test. There's no punishment for that because the parent is looking at it exactly from the perspective that Joshua was talking about, which is, well, why didn't they? What is the obstacle that they were facing? How do we address and partner with the problem, not with the outcome? And so that's one very specific example. Another one is from a member of our community who's talked about this publicly and tells a story about their child at Thanksgiving when they were small, and how every Thanksgiving was a disaster, that they would go to the family member's house who was hosting, and it was loud and it was lots of people and it was hot and there were lots of smells. And shortly after arriving, every relative had an expectation of give me a hug, give me a kiss, sit nicely in your chair, eat this. And the child would not be able to manage, and the family would have to like pack up and leave early. Until one year, the mother just decided this year we're going in two cars. One parent and one child in one car, and the other parent and the other child in the other car. And when we get there, this child is going to be separated in a place where they feel safe, where things are quiet, where things are manageable. We're going to have activities for them to do that they enjoy. And the family who wants to see them is going to come in and out, manageable quantities of people. And that Thanksgiving went off without a hitch because the parent was partnering with the child to teach them how to get their needs met in a setting that wasn't designed for their needs. And then that quality of life, Jen, that you're talking about improves because of that teaching of how to take care of yourself, which was really what was being imparted from parent to child.
And, I want to add that we recognize that they do hit developmental milestones. And so we recognize that teenagers can be a jerk. And that does not mean that that's necessarily a symptom of whatever is occurring. And so when we use that palliative parenting paradigm, then what we can do is we can say to our child very openly and honestly, are you being a jerk right now because you're being a typical teenager? Or do you feel like this is symptomatic and we really need to sit down and partner with each other and maybe make a call to the doctor because maybe we need to make some adjustments. And we've had teenagers turn to their parents and say, nah, I'm just being a teenage jerk. And the parent can say, well, stop it, right? And then they can. Um, but again, it's because they've been using an approach that has been palliative, and because there's so much trust and respect going both ways, that when there's normal irritability, because that happens to all of us, then they can say that without it actually triggering, oh, you think I'm always irritable, or I'm always a grumpy person, or I'm always an unpleasant person. No, that's not what we're saying. What we're saying is, I just want to validate whatever is happening. And I just want to make sure that like we all understand and we're all on the same page.
So we have only a few minutes left, and we have one more sort of learning objectives, which is really to break down and talk about how does this approach that we've been talking about accomplish what you're describing. And there are three sort of different pillars of this framework, right? There's acceptance, there's respect, and there's community. So I'm hoping you could each talk a little bit about each of those pillars in the few minutes that we have left. To the audience, we will likely run over a little bit. Please bear with us. Keep putting your questions in the chat or in the Q&A, and I will continue to add them. So acceptance, how does that integrate into what we're trying to accomplish?
So I'll start with that one. So I'll give kind of a scenario that piggybacks on the last question. So what is a real life example? You have a kid who's really dysregulated. You start to see them getting frustrated. They're playing with a toy. In my mind, here we go. Here we go. Why don't they walk? Hey, play with something else. No. Eventually the toy breaks because they've been slamming it. So my perspective is this kid isn't mean. This kid isn't bratty. This is a whole little person trying to figure out how to do life. So I'm coming in from a respectful, holistic point of view. This kid is trying to figure out how to do life. So when I approach my kid or that kid, I'm sharing their point of view. So instead of, I told you that was going to happen. Why did you bang it? That was expensive. That means I'm spending more energy making them feel small than I am trying to raise them up out of this funky situation. So I'm respectfully giving them a whole view of self, respectful, right? So I share their agony. Oh man. Oh man. Did you want the leg to break off? Or this surprised you that you banged it and it broke? So now I'm allowing this kid to save face and to identify, I'm out of control. I didn't mean to break my favorite thing. Or I did mean to break it because that's how furious I was, right? So I'm approaching with respect and curiosity. Because I'm doing this repeatedly, anyone around me, any community member sees, oh, this is another way to approach this person. This is another way to problem solve. This is a way to de-escalate. Like they're de-escalating first and then problem solving. And so we do these things over and over because we're not just teaching ourselves first, we're teaching this other little person, but over time we're doing it more confidently. So we'll say it a bit loudly. Our kid will respond loud enough for other people to listen. And so then we are co-creating this new way to work together, right? Because there's lots of people who share strife or overwhelm who are masking it, that we work with, that we go shopping with in a store. And so if we can respond as seeing a whole person like, whoa, did I catch you off guard? Because you just kind of shoved me with the cart. I'm allowing them to save face. I'm allowing them to problem solve from where they are, right? And so those are two big tenets. Like if we approach with respect and curiosity, then it allows for bigger growth for our community at large.
And I hear you say
you bundled them all together there. That was beautiful. Jen, go ahead.
Oh, I was going to say, like, what I hear Joshua saying is that there's acceptance, right? Of like, I have to do things differently because my child experiences the world in a very different way. And so we're assisting families that their journey is going to look different. And sometimes it's radically different than how it looks for anyone else or any other parent. And that's okay. And it really starts with that acceptance of understanding that this child needs something different.
Hmm. And 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 how does that roll into respect?
Yeah, well, parents, when we talked about enabling and it looks like that, and Joshua said, this couldn't be further from the truth, right? And that's absolutely spot on because parents are taking control of what their boundaries are, their limitations, their expectations. And expectations doesn't mean that the child needs to meet expectations. It means that we actually have to lower in that moment that it's all falling apart, we lower our demands and we lower our expectations so we can get through this in a way where everybody's needs are met. And so the example at the dinner table that I think of a lot is when one parent has said to everyone else who gets on to the child, but their child lived with a mood disorder, and people were like, "Get your elbows off the table," or "Stop chewing too loudly," or "Stop this," or "Stop that," and the parent stood up and said, "Hey, I am this child's parent, and if there's going to be any correcting to do, I'm going to be the one to do it." And it wasn't, it was setting a boundary, it was setting limitations, it was appropriate, it was setting expectations for everybody else who was sitting there of I expect you, just not say anything. And that is because the parent knew in order for this to be peaceful for everybody, we need to not have nagging. You don't need to correct them. We just need to be able to get through that. And so there's that respect element that is happening. I respect this child enough to be able to stand up and advocate and set those limits and set those expectations for other people. And then when I look at our last tenet or our last principle that we have, because we have acceptance and respect, we also have community. It's what we're creating here at CMHRC. And so not just for our members who show up each week, but also to be able to reach the broader community in so many ways. We're creating that so people ultimately find their village through discovery, through creation. I remember there's this saying that says the the mother of all inventions is necessity. It is a necessity to be able to create community, and ongoing support is something that we have the right to ask for. Right? We don't need to be timid or hesitant. We have the right to say, this is what I need right now from all of you. And we have the right to expect it as well and to receive that. So community is vital for us.
Joshua.
I just wanted to add on Jennifer's note, because everyone's going to walk away into their own little worlds again. Um, just because you're giving a kid direction or information does not mean that it is helpful. So
Mm.
it may feel to you accurate, timely, but unless you see who is in front of you, it may be so harmful, so far away from helpful. As Jennifer described the table. Maybe everyone was trying to be helpful from their own point of view, but that wasn't helpful to that child and how they took in information, the quantity of information they could take in. And so we always need to assess, I may have all these intentions, but is it actually helpful to the little person in front of me? Is it helpful to our family? So if you are implementing an approach that's creating stress, chaos, doubt, guilt, and shame, then it's time to pivot and try a new approach. Because I assure you, many people have tried the extremes from crying, begging, to taking away and punishing, and you're still hitting up against the wall. So what have you got to lose if you just do a total reset and look into this?
So there's a great question that just came in through the Q&A about what role does cultural responsiveness play in providing these kinds of supports to children? And I think what they're really asking is how do we navigate this approach across different cultural sets of cultural expectations?
So I will speak on acceptance of what you're working with. So not what your child necessarily, but the social dynamics in your culture, financial, gender, all those things play a role into what you perceive as how stuck you are or where you're beginning. I would challenge people to look as a child of immigrants, first generation American, the whole nine. I advocate to look at our children as citizens of the world who have to be able to navigate a variety of cultural expectations and standards. And so if you feel stifled or stuck within the cultural expectations in which you've married into or you're born into, you're going to have to be strong enough to expand your bubble. That's the only way for you to get enough room to take in new information, to practice that information, to try that information. But you are going to have to be brave enough to push back. No, my kid is not going to kiss everyone because that's what we've done for centuries in my family culturally. There are certain things where you're going to have to be the warrior for your child. And so it doesn't mean you're burning down everything, but it does mean you have to cultivate the new way of being for your child because they're not coming in. They're just a different person than you were or someone else. So bravery means you're going to start curating the gems of your culture and bringing in other things.
Yeah, and I look at it like I we're in the lower southern states here, and so people say yes ma'am, no ma'am, no yes sir, no sir, and take it as a sign of disrespect. So when a child who is going through a lot of challenges or struggles in that moment fails to respond that way, they look at it as a sign of disrespect. And that grunt that they just gave you was that sign of respect to you. But also from a clinical angle, I want to say that there are some cultural biases, and it's unintentional at times. And so there are prejudices that are out there. And it is unfortunate that there are some children that are labeled as having conduct disorder or oppositional defiant disorder. And so we really need to be on guard. And there is nothing that gets my dander up more than when I see those. Because why? Why are we doing this? And I'm always looking for, is there a bias that is happening? That this is the diagnosis, that this is the rush that we're giving. So on the other end of that, I just want to really encourage parents to be on the lookout for that's absolutely possible. And the literature supports that it does happen. And so that we need to be our child's advocate and that there are things that we do not have to accept on the record and that we can push back and challenge.
I love the way each of you answered that because Joshua, you really took the perspective of the family and how you can, I love the word curate that you used, that we're curating the things culturally that we value and how to incorporate those for our child in a way that is going to add to their life experience, while also being brave enough to say, some of these things aren't going to work for my child because my child is a unique individual. And Jen, you're really coming at it from the clinical standpoint of, how do we acknowledge the bias that we have as providers when we're coming in to be able to say, like, not all things will work for all children. And in addition to that, not all things will work for all cultures, and that it's really important that we assess children and adults for that matter, not based on preconceived ideas of who or what they should be, but based on who they are, which can sound to a lot of people like we're really advocating a much more individualistic approach as opposed to a collectivistic one. But that when we are working with a single individual, we are looking at them as an individual within the collective of their life experience, and being able to balance both of those in respect with one another is really an important part of what we do as providers. All right. Well, we are wrapping up. We've gone over a little bit. I want to give each of our guests an opportunity to sum up if there's anything else that you would like to add before we go. Anything that we missed that you want to touch on before we say good night?
No, I just want to thank you for the opportunity to be able to talk about this new approach, and thank you so much, because those principles of advocacy, or not advocacy, I'm sorry, but acceptance and respect, and community, they're vital, and I really feel like it has a lot to offer parents.
Joshua?
I just like to say we accept and appreciate the challenges we are supporting our child through, always with the eye on the bigger picture of they can't do it today, but I'm coaching toward when they can do it tomorrow, next month, next year. And so while we may not hit, in quotes, typical milestones, or be in typical developmental phases, it doesn't mean we're saying it's never going to happen. It's just saying, I appreciate it is going to happen in your own time, and I'm here with you.
Well, thank you both for that. It's tremendously valuable information and perspectives, and hopefully it will open people's eyes to a new way of thinking about parenting children who have mental and physical health care struggles. So thank you.